Hey everybody, it's Gus with Egypt Adventures Travel. In today's video, I'm going to tackle a question I get asked all the time. Is Egypt a safe place for gay and lesbian travelers? Before I start talking about safety in Egypt for LGBTQ+ travelers, I want to remind everybody that I make customized itineraries and connect travelers with local guides in Egypt. I also can book your entire Egypt adventure for you, including your domestic flights, hotels, and activities. And I'm also available to guide your trip myself as your personal live-in Arabic interpreter, nightlife guide, and more. So get in touch with me today, shoot me an email at egyptadventurestravel@gmail.com, and let's start planning your Egypt adventure. So now, on to talking about safety in Egypt for gay and lesbian travelers. I know that there are lots of different identities under the LGBTQ+ rainbow. For the purposes of today's video, I'm mostly going to be focusing on gay and lesbian travelers just because I have not heard a lot about the experiences from bisexual, transgender, intersex, or other folks under the queer umbrella. I do hear a lot of times about the experiences of gay men and lesbians traveling to Egypt, so that's what I'm going to focus on during this video. I hope that later on I can do a more robust video series on this topic, and that I could even feature some interviews from people from the LGBTQ+ family who've traveled to Egypt and what their experience is like. I want to talk about 4 different topics in today's video. The first thing I want to talk about is the legality of being gay in Egypt. The second thing I want to talk about is the difference between perceived identity in the United States and in Egypt. Next, I'm going to talk in general about the privilege that foreign tourists in Egypt have. And I'm going to finish out the video by giving some tips and tricks for gay and lesbian travelers who want to visit Egypt. First, the legal status of being queer in Egypt. In Egypt right now, it currently is not written down per se that somebody cannot be gay or lesbian or bisexual or transgender. But what law they do have on the books is a law that prohibits debauchery and that prohibits prostitution. And a lot of times this law, and this is kind of an oversimplification, you can read a lot more about this online if you do some searching, but a lot of times this law is used to persecute LGBTQ+ people in Egypt. However, it is extremely, extremely rare for this to ever impact anybody who is not a local Egyptian or somebody who is from the United States or Europe. More on that later when I talk about the privilege of being a foreign tourist in Egypt. So essentially, yes, it's not okay to be gay or lesbian in Egypt, but nothing is really happening that impacts gay and lesbian travelers from Europe or the United States, at least not in my experience. Now, number 2, the difference between perceived identity in the United States and in Egypt. When people are in the US, they have a very clear conception about what it means to be gay or lesbian or transgender, and in Egypt, those ideas are totally different. I'm just going to give you some examples. In the United States, if men dress a certain way, people might assume that they're gay. But in Egypt, the style of dress is totally different. And sometimes Egyptians are not even going to pick up on some of the cues that somebody is gay or lesbian from the United States or from Europe because their conception of what that means in Egypt is totally different. Another example. In Egypt, it's extremely common for men who are friends to hold hands, to kiss each other on the cheek, all sorts of behavior that we would determine is gay in the United States. But in Egypt, it's totally normal. So a lot of times when gay and lesbian travelers talk about going to Egypt and they ask about, is it safe? I often tell them that if they're going to be in Egypt for just a week-long trip, a lot of people are not even going to pick up on the fact that they're gay, or they might not even know at all. And this segues into my third point, talking about the privilege that foreign tourists have in Egypt. So a lot of times Egyptians are not even going to pick up on the fact that a traveler is not straight. But even if they do, the privilege that foreigners have in Egypt is immense, especially white people from countries in Europe or the United States. We go to Egypt and we bring a lot of money into their local economy. People in Egypt depend on tourists, they depend on tips, they depend on their income from taking people to restaurants and shops and the historic sites. So even if people notice that somebody is LGBTQ+, they're probably not going to care because they know that you're there to spend money, you're there for a limited amount of time, and you're not there with an agenda or to necessarily influence anybody in Egypt or to talk about being gay. You're just there to have a great time exploring the country and to give lots of money to local people. Case in point, there are several LGBTQ+ companies that offer trips to Egypt where the whole entire trip is queer people. These companies offer these trips, and I'm sure that the Egyptians they work with know what's going on during this trip, in that all the travelers are gay or lesbian. But they don't care because these people are bringing in tons and tons of money into Egypt. They're foreigners, they're from places like the US and Europe. And the way that it works in Egypt, these people just have a lot of privilege, which makes us really, really lucky as travelers. And it makes things not really something you need to worry about when you're gay or lesbian and you're gonna be spending a week in Egypt. The last thing I wanna talk about is tips and tricks for gay and lesbian travelers to Egypt in order to have a safe and a good experience. So I get asked a lot if people can stay in the same hotel room, or if they stay in the same hotel room, if they can have one bed to share, if let's say it's two men who are a couple. And what I tell people is, if you're staying at international brands like a Marriott hotel or a Hilton hotel, by all means, tell them that you want to have one single large bed. They're not going to bat an eyelash. They're not going to care. If you're staying at a smaller family-run boutique hotel, I always recommend that gay and lesbian travelers or anybody of the same gender get two separate beds. But you still could try to get one large bed and see what the reception or what the hotel staff say. They might be totally fine with it, going back again to that privilege of being a foreigner. But I recommend that people do separate beds if you're in a smaller hotel. Another tip I have is just to simply not talk to anybody about being gay and lesbian during your trip. People in Egypt oftentimes will ask a lot of personal questions like, are you married? Do you have any kids? If you don't have any kids, why don't you have any kids? But you can always answer these questions and brush things off like, oh, I'm not married. I like living the single life. I don't really want to have children. I like my freedom, etc., etc. You never need to talk to anybody about being gay. You don't need to tell anybody about it. And if you just keep that a secret, then that's going to mean that you're never going to have to broach the topic with anybody. And even if they suspect that you're LGBTQ+, Egyptians are not going to say anything about it. Again, going back to that topic earlier of talking about the privilege of being a foreign tourist in Egypt and how people in Egypt are just happy to show you the country and to make some money in the process. And I know that for many LGBTQ+ folks, this is going to sound like they have to go back into the closet in order to travel to Egypt, and they have to hide a part of their identity, which I totally understand. Egypt, like a lot of places in the world that are not accepting to LGBTQ+ folks on a whole, will be a place that somebody has to decide, is it worth it for me to go there? If I go there for 10 days and I have to just hide a certain part of who I am, but then I get to experience the amazing history and culture and heritage of this place, somebody has to weigh the positives and the negatives of that. From what I've heard from many LGBTQ+ travelers is that it's totally, totally worth it to go to Egypt and they have a totally safe and comfortable time. But everybody's got to make that decision for themselves. So that's it. I just talked about the safety of traveling to Egypt for gay and lesbian travelers, and I talked about the current legality of being gay or lesbian in Egypt. I talked about the privilege that these types of travelers have anyway, especially if they're white and they're from countries like Europe or the United States. I talked about the difference in perceived identity between being gay in the United States or Europe and Egypt. And then I gave you a few tips and tricks for the gay and lesbian travelers who decide to make their way to the land of the pharaohs. I'd love to get in touch with you and talk about your Egypt adventure. Shoot me an email anytime, egyptadventurestravel@gmail.com. And again, I'm Gus with Egypt Adventures Travel. Thanks for watching. Check us out on Instagram or Facebook at Egypt Adventures Travel, or go to www.egyptadventurestravel.com.